Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the notion about costing election platforms, because that's something we pay a great deal of attention to here in Canada. I don't know that it's necessarily as much in other countries, but it's something we've tended to have a big focus on since we had our big mid-90s budget crisis and the notion of balanced budgets became de rigueur. We are now in a somewhat post-balanced budget era where parties are promising deficits in the short and medium term. And in order to kind of prove that they're not being wildly irresponsible about it, we are seeing various aspects about how they're costing their promises in order to prove that they're still being responsible. One of the things that is new in this election cycle is the fact that the Parliamentary Budget Officer is now being given the ability to cost certain promises that parties are making, and he's been given some resources to do that. But this is not quite the panacea that it may seem to be, and it is causing a bit of confusion and some more problems than I think it's actually intended to solve. Part of the problem is that the PBO is only costing specific promises and not a whole platform. Because specific promises can change fiscal assumptions, you can't just add them up and go, pluses and minuses and hope they achieve something close to balance. When you change certain programs, it changes the assumptions behind it. It changes the ways in which things like tax credits accumulate or accrue. So it's hard to just add promises together and hope that it all balances out, because assumptions can change along the way, and changes in one can affect outcomes in another, and that can create numbers that are not what you're expecting if you just add what's there. So we still need to have some kind of outside agents to kind of look over those numbers and make sure that they make sense based on what kind of data that they're able to use and gather for that. Some of it they can't necessarily, because income tax data, for example, is fairly proprietary for the government. And it's difficult to say how some proposed tax changes will kind of trickle through the system. So that makes it more difficult for some of these promises to be properly accumulated in the final tally. The other thing I think we should really kind of pay attention to with this new dependence on the Parliamentary Budget Officer in doing this is that in my personal opinion, has the potential to damage the institution of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, because he's essentially giving his blessing to certain items which are based on, we'll say, basically the party, they have to take the party's word for it. There were a couple of promises, for example, where the Conservatives said, we'll cut 1.5 billion in corporate subsidies every year. And so the PBO basically has to say, well, you say it's 1.5 billion. We're going to take your word it's 1.5 billion, because they didn't have any information as to what programs those would be coming out of. And the problem with that is that these kinds of subsidies all have constituencies that governments want to keep happy. So you may promise 1.5 billion and think it's going to be easy because that's, just a slice out of the pie every year. But once you start looking into where those constituencies are and how that can affect your own electoral fortunes, the math suddenly becomes much more difficult. And the PBO isn't able to, make those kinds of assessments, and yet we have a document on PBO letterhead that says 1.5 billion for 10 years. Like, it's not feasible, and it damages the credibility of the PBO, because a party can say, well, the PBO said that it was credible, even though they didn't really have anything to work with. So I think that's one of the flaws in bringing in the PBO to do this kind of election costing, as opposed to kind of having private sector economists do, which was sort of how they would do it in the past. That also in the past led to certain discrepancies in credibility, particularly in the assumptions that some parties were using. But I do think there was more value in having an exterior costing than having the PBO do it, because of the political nature of what they're asking the PBO to do, and that creates problems down the road. The other thing to consider when you look at the different party platforms and their costing is that implementation matters. And this is kind of my buzzword going forward for the next few weeks, is because parties can promise a lot of things, but unless they have details about how they're going to implement them, that affects how the costing works. For example, Pharmacare, two of the big or three parties are all making promises around it, but provinces have to implement it. And so it's hard to say what your costing is going to be when this is still basically subject to negotiation with provinces, because they're the ones who have to do the administration of those programs. Another way in which implementation matters is in certain things like collection of revenues. The NDP are promising a super wealth tax that they say is going to generate billions of dollars, but it essentially requires them to build an entirely new tax structure. It's not something that can be grafted on to the way in which our current tax system operates, because it's based on an American notion, and Americans collect taxes very differently than the Canadian Revenue Agency does. So promising all of these revenues when you don't have an actual structure that can capture them in the way you're saying you're going to is problematic, and it's going to affect your assumptions, particularly once people who have access to very good accountants start finding ways of diverting that kind of income. So this is another way in which implementation matters, and why that's important when you're looking at the costing of promises in election platforms. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.